officers, F.B. Day and D.W. Mixon, got on the bus. Blake pointed to Mrs. Parks, said he needed the seat, and that the other ones stood up. The two policemen came toward her, and one, in Mrs. Parks' words, asked me if the driver hadn't asked me to stand. I said yes. He asked, "Why didn't you stand up?" I said I didn't think I should have to. I asked him, "Why do you push us around?" He said, "I don't know, but the law is the law, and you are under arrest." So, the moment he said I was under arrest, I stood up. One picked up my purse, one picked up my shopping bag, and we got off the bus. They escorted her to the patrol car and returned to talk to Blake. The driver confirmed that he wanted to press charges under Montgomery's bus segregation ordinance, and the officers took Mrs. Parks first to police headquarters and then to the city jail. By then, Mrs. Parks was tense, and her throat was uncommonly dry. She spied a water fountain, but was quickly told that she could not drink from it. It was for whites only. Her processing complete, Mrs. Parks was allowed to call home and tell her family what had transpired. Word of Mrs. Parks' arrest began to spread even before that phone call. One passenger on the bus told a friend of Mrs. Parks about the event, and that friend, Mrs. Bertha Butler, immediately called the home of longtime black activist E.D. Nixon, a past president of Montgomery's National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP chapter, and the most outspoken figure in the black community. Nixon was not at home, but his wife Arlette was, and she phoned his small downtown office. Nixon was out at the moment, but when he returned a few moments later, he saw the message to call home. "What's up?" he asked his wife. She told him of Mrs. Parks' arrest, but couldn't tell him what the charge was. Nixon hung up and immediately called the police station. The desk officer rudely told Nixon that the charges against Mrs. Parks were none of his business. Determined to pursue the matter, but knowing that Montgomery's principal black lawyer, Fred Gray, was out of town, Nixon called the home of a white lawyer, Clifford Durr, one of the city's few racial liberals. Durr agreed to call the station and learn the charges, and after doing so, he immediately called Nixon back and related the details. Nixon told Durr that he would go down and sign the $100 bond to secure Mrs. Parks' release, and Durr told him to stop by and that he would go along. When Nixon pulled up in front of the house, both Durr and his wife Virginia hurried out to meet him, and the three set off for the city jail. Mrs. Parks, Mr. Nixon, and the Durrs all had known each other for a number of years. Mrs. Parks, 42 years old at the time of her arrest, had been an active member and occasional officer of Montgomery's NAACP chapter since 1943, and had worked with Nixon on a number of voter registration efforts. Nixon, a Pullman porter whose job regularly took him to Chicago and other northern cities, had been a stalwart member of A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, as well as a local activist since the 1920s. The Durrs, Alabama natives who had returned to the state several years earlier following Clifford's service on the Federal Communications Commission, had become friendly with Nixon through his political activism. Needing a good seamstress to help with her children's clothes, Mrs. Durr had asked Nixon if he could recommend anyone, and Nixon told her he knew just the person, his NAACP colleague, Mrs. Rosa Parks. Beginning in 1953 or 1954, Mrs. Parks was a regular visitor to the Durrs' home. Over the years, the Durrs had heard distressing stories of how Montgomery bus drivers regularly insulted black passengers. Mrs. Parks once told them about how she had been physically thrown off a bus some 10 years earlier, when, after paying her fare at the front of the bus, she had refused to get off and re-enter by the back door, a custom often inflicted on black riders. On their way to the jail, Nixon and the Durrs discussed the possibility of Mrs. Parks being a test case. They knew how strong her character was, and they had seen a strengthened self-confidence in her the past few months, following a 2-week interracial conference.